Welcome back to Dreamtime Discoveries. Tonight. We step into the shadowed world of the men in black, the Watchers. Who arrive when UFO encounters cross a line. They appear without warning, at your door, in the hallway, beside a parked car. Black suits, crisp hats, polished shoes, faces pale, eyes that seem to see through you. They come after the lights in the sky, the strange craft, the evidence you thought no one else knew about. And when they leave, so does your certainty? For decades, the same unsettling story repeats. Government agents, or something far stranger, wearing human form. Before we begin, who do you think they are? Please leave a comment below. Now. Let the stories sail. The Herbert Hopkins, Old Orchard Beach visit, Maine, USA. Herbert Hopkins. The Old Orchard Beach visit, 1976. Old Orchard Beach, Maine, USA. It was a quiet evening in 1976. When Dr. Herbert Hopkins, a respected physician in Old Orchard Beach, Maine, and part-time consultant for a local UFO investigation, received an unexpected phone call. Hopkins was alone at home, reviewing notes at his desk. A small stack of neatly organized papers related to the case he was assisting with. The voice on the other end was calm, polite, and precise. The caller introduced himself as a fellow UFO researcher and said he wished to discuss the very case Hopkins was working on. There was no demand, no alarm in his tone, only the implication that this was important and should happen that evening. Hopkins agreed, setting the receiver down with only a passing thought about the unusual short notice. Within minutes, there was a knock at the front door. Standing there was a man unlike anyone Hopkins had met, thin to the point of frailty, skin so pale it carried no hint of natural flush. His perfectly tailored black suit fit without a crease out of place, and a derby hat shaded his face. When he stepped inside at Hopkins' invitation, the light revealed details that stayed with Hopkins for the rest of his life. Skin that appeared almost waxy, stretched evenly as if poured over bone. Lips a vivid, unnatural shade of red, so sharply defined they looked painted on. The man's movements were precise, smooth, and devoid of the small, unconscious adjustments that make most people seem alive. Hopkins, who was trained to read the subtlest human cues, found himself unsettled by the absence of them. They sat in the living room. The visitor wasted no time with pleasantries. His questions were direct, as if he already knew the contours of the main UFO case, and was simply confirming details. He wanted to know about the witnesses, the physical trace evidence, and how and where it had been stored. Hopkins noticed that throughout the exchange, the man never once broke eye contact. Midway through the conversation, the man reached into his pocket and drew out a small coin. He rolled it slowly between his fingers, a movement deliberate. Hopkins' eyes stayed on it, and then, without a flick or flourish, the coin began to fade. Its edges blurred, its shine dulled, and within moments it seemed to dissolve entirely, leaving nothing between the man's fingertips. "You will stop your work on this case," the man said. His tone carried no threat, no rise or fall, simply a statement delivered with finality. He asked a few more questions, revisiting the same topics. The inquiries seemed to test Hopkins' responses for consistency. As the conversation went on, the man's demeanor shifted. His speech slowed, each sentence broken by measured pauses. His movements grew stiff, almost mechanical. Finally, he said, My energy is running low. I must leave. Asterisk, he rose, adjusted his derby hat with care, and walked to the door. Hopkins followed him onto the porch. The man descended the steps and moved into the darkness. No headlights appeared. No car door closed, and Hopkins heard no sound of an engine starting. That night, Hopkins acted without hesitation. He went to his office and methodically destroyed every UFO research file in his possession. The case notes, the photographs, the transcripts, all gone before morning. The change in Hopkins' demeanor was immediate. In the days that followed, calls from other investigators went unanswered. When one colleague managed to reach him, Hopkins's voice was flat, his replies short. "I'm stepping away from that work," he said. No elaboration. A fellow researcher from out of state, who had been scheduled to visit, received a polite but firm cancellation. "Circumstances have changed," Hopkins told him. Locally. The shift was noticed in quieter ways. A librarian at the old Orchard Beach Historical Society recalled how Hopkins, who had been requesting materials on unusual aerial phenomena, suddenly stopped. One week he was calling every couple of days, she said. And then nothing. It was like a door closed. Even neighbors saw a difference. One remarked to a friend that Hopkins seemed more private after that week. The curtains in his home were drawn more often, and the porch light, once left on into the evening, was dark. Word of the incident did not spread through headlines, but through letters, phone calls, and conversations at small gatherings of UFO investigators. The story's details were passed carefully, sometimes altered in minor ways by retelling, but the central image remained the same. Pale man in a black suit, arriving within minutes of a phone call, performing an impossible act with a coin, and leaving behind an empty resolve where an active investigation had been. Speculation arose quickly. Some suggested the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, pointing to its history of interviewing and sometimes discouraging UFO witnesses. Others considered the FBI, citing its occasional surveillance of civilian researchers during the previous decade. But many, perhaps most, classified it among the clearest examples of a Men in Black encounter, noting the precision of the visit and the complete cessation of Hopkins' work. Afterward. At a small conference in New England months later, a speaker alluded to the case without naming Hopkins directly. Those who knew the details exchanged glances. The allusion was enough. By the end of the month, Hopkins had removed himself from all UFO-related correspondence. When an old acquaintance in the field stopped by his office unannounced, Hopkins greeted him warmly, but refused to discuss any aspect of the main case. "It's closed," he said, and moved the conversation to fishing. Weather and local news. Friends noticed subtler changes. Too. Hopkins no longer attended the occasional evening gatherings where local enthusiasts would share stories. His interest in certain fringe topics vanished. One former colleague put it plainly. The man I knew was curious, even about the strangest claims. After that night, that curiosity was gone. In the years that followed, the Herbert Hopkins case settled into the quiet but enduring corner of amoeba lore, cited in books, mentioned in lectures. And debated in small circles. Its strength lay not in physical evidence, but in its precision. A lone man, a brief meeting, a single inexplicable demonstration, and the complete silencing of a willing researcher. Hopkins himself never publicly elaborated beyond the original account. When asked about it in later years, he would only say, "It happened exactly as I said it did. I've said all I need to say for those who study the Men in Black phenomenon. It stands as one of the rare cases where the purpose of the visit was achieved without intimidation or force. The files were gone, the work abandoned, and the witness stepped away, all within a single evening. Maury Island Incident, June 1947, the Maury Island Incident. Washington, USA. Puget Sound, Washington. USA. The morning was calm over Puget Sound in June 1947. Harold Dahl was out on his small patrol boat with his son, the family dog, and 2 crewmen, when 6 metallic discs appeared overhead. They moved in a slow, tight formation. One faltered. It tilted and dropped a spray of molten debris. Fragments hissed into the water. Others struck the boat. A piece burned Dahl's son. Another killed the dog. Dahl steered clear as the formation regrouped and slipped west into the haze. He kept a few shards from the deck, some light and brittle, others unervingly heavy dot back on shore. He told only a small circle. His boss, Fred Chrisman, and 2 close friends. Dahl had no interest in making the story public. He hadn't even told his wife. But by the following morning, something felt off. A call came to his home from a man he didn't recognize. The voice was polite ... but left no room for refusal. The caller suggested they meet for breakfast at a diner in Tacoma, and named the place and time before Dahl could respond. Asterisk, when he walked into the diner, the man was already there, seated in a booth near the back. He wore a black suit, crisp white shirt, and narrow black tie. His hat rested neatly on the seat beside him. Dahl slid into the booth opposite. The man didn't offer a name, didn't shake hands. He simply looked at Dahl with a steady, unblinking gaze, and began to speak. "You had quite an experience out there on the water," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Then he described it, the number of craft ... the movement of the one that wobbled ... the spray of debris, the injury to Dahl's son, the death of the dog. Every detail was exact. Dahl sat in silence ... listening, wondering how the man could possibly know. At one point, the man leaned in slightly. "It would be better," he said, "for you and your family, if you forget what you saw." There was no threat in his tone, no visible anger, but there was weight behind the words. As though the outcome was already decided, Dahl noticed the man's face was pale, his features sharp, but oddly flat, like someone used to keeping expression to a minimum. His speech was measured, almost rehearsed. The conversation was brief, no more than 15 minutes. And when it was over, the man stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. He didn't pay for his coffee. Through the diner's front window, Dahl watched him step into a black sedan parked at the curb. The car pulled away into the light morning traffic and was gone. That meeting left an imprint Dahl couldn't shake. He felt the man hadn't been trying to convince him of anything, just delivering an instruction and ensuring he understood. That night, Dahl barely slept. He kept replaying the moment when the man recounted the injury to his son. It wasn't just that he knew. It was how casually he spoke of it, ... as if the knowledge itself was mundane ... in the days that followed. Dahl avoided talking about the sighting. When a local reporter approached him after hearing rumors of strange discs over the sound, Dahl shrugged it off as a mistake or misinterpretation. Within a week, he publicly retracted his account entirely. But the story had already reached further than he intended. Chrisman ... still convinced something strange had happened, had written to an Army Air Force contact describing the incident and offering to show the debris. Soon, Two intelligence officers, Captain William Davidson and Lieutenant Frank Brown, flew up from Hamilton Field in California to speak with both men. The officers interviewed Dahl at length, asking for precise times, positions, and descriptions of the objects. They examined the boat's damage and took samples of the debris, noting in their records that some of the material had a slag-like texture unlike common alloys. They also recorded inconsistencies in Dahl's account, changes in the sequence of events, uncertainty about exact distances. Whether those discrepancies came from genuine confusion or from Dahl's reluctance to speak openly, they couldn't tell. When the interviews were over, Davidson and Brown boarded their B-25 bomber for the flight back to California, carrying the debris samples with them. Somewhere near Kelso, Washington, the plane caught fire and crashed. Both men were killed. The debris was destroyed in the blaze. News of the crash filtered quickly through military channels, but was presented to the public as a tragic accident. No mention was made of what the officers had been carrying. For Dahl, the event only reinforced his decision to remain silent. He had been told clearly to forget what he saw, and now two men were dead. In private, he confided to a friend that the meeting at the diner had felt less like a conversation and more like being read into a situation he didn't want to be part of. The Air Force eventually issued a statement calling the Maury Island case a hoax, citing Dahl's own retraction. But the timeline, a sighting, a mysterious visit, a reluctant witness, and an unexplained loss of physical evidence, didn't sit right with everyone. Over the years, the story became part of the early foundation of Men in Black lore. Researchers pointed to the quiet precision of the visit, the way the man seemed less concerned with details of the sighting than with Dahl's willingness to talk about it. They noted that he had appeared without credentials, without a name, yet with total authority over the direction of the conversation. In later decades, similar reports would emerge. Witnesses describing unexpected visits from men in black suits who knew details they couldn't have learned through normal means, who issued instructions without open threats, and who left behind more questions than answers. The Maury Island incident became the earliest known example of that pattern for Harold Dahl. The discs over the sound may have been extraordinary, but they were fleeting, a matter of minutes in an otherwise ordinary day. The man in the diner was different. He had been deliberate, present, unavoidable. If the discs were the mystery, the man was the consequence. And in the years that followed, in story after story, that consequence would appear again and again. A knock at the door, a black car waiting outside, and someone who already knew exactly what you had seen. The Robert Richardson Incident, Ohio, USA. The Robert Richardson Incident, July 1967, Toledo, Ohio, USA, on a warm July 1967 night, just after midnight. 19-year-old University of Toledo student Robert Richardson was driving home along a dim, quiet road. A metallic flash appeared in his headlights, and a second later, his bumper struck it with a sharp jolt. He stopped the car, pulled over, and stepped out. The road was empty. Silent, except for his cooling engine. A few steps back, he found a small silvery fragment, like, metallic, and oddly cool to the touch. He slipped it into his pocket and drove on. The next day, he told a local UFO research group he sometimes contacted. They urged him to keep it safe for analysis. Richardson placed it in a bedroom drawer. Deciding it could wait. 2 days later, there was a knock at the front door. When Richardson opened it, 2 men were standing on the porch. They were tall, dressed in dark suits despite the July heat, with narrow ties and crisp white shirts. One appeared to be in his late 30s, the other older, perhaps in his 50s. Both pale and expressionless. The older man spoke first. "Mr. Richardson, you have something that does not belong to you." Double quotes. Richardson. Caught off guard, asked them to explain. "You took a piece of metal from the scene of an incident," the man replied, his tone flat, almost mechanical. Richardson denied it at first, unsure of who they were or how they would react. The younger man stepped forward slightly, producing from his jacket a notepad with an address, Richardson's, and a series of numbers he recognized as his driver's license and university ID. "We know where you are. We know what you have," the older man continued. "You will give it to us." When Richardson asked for identification, the men ignored the request. They did not claim to be police, nor any branch of government. Instead, the younger one simply said, "It is important for your safety that you comply." Their presence had a weight to it, as if they were operating under authority without needing to state it. The conversation was brief, no more than 5 minutes. When Richardson told them the piece had already been sent away for analysis, which was true, the older man's expression didn't change, but he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "If you are lying, it will be worse for you." Without another word, they turned in unison and walked to a black 1963 Cadillac sedan parked at the curb. The car pulled away without engine noise reaching his ears, disappearing into the next block. If Richardson thought that would be the end of it, he was wrong. 3 nights later, around 9 p.m., there was another knock. This time, it was just one man, younger than either of the first pair, wearing the same kind of dark suit, but with a pale gray fedora pulled low over his brow. His skin, Richardson later said, had the oddest texture, like it was too smooth. The man's tone was less formal. More conversational, but the message was the same. The fragment must be returned. When Richardson repeated that it was no longer in his possession, the man smiled faintly and said, "You will retrieve it?" Then he stepped closer and asked a question Richardson would remember for the rest of his life. "How would you like it if we harmed someone close to you?" "Your wife." Perhaps. Richardson wasn't married, but he had been dating a woman steadily for months. The man named her first and last name and recited her address. Then, as if he had not just made a threat, he tipped his hat slightly and walked away. From that night on, Richardson's sense of safety changed. The fragment was already out of his reach. The UFO group had passed it to a researcher for metallurgical testing. But the men's knowledge of his life, their precision in details, lingered. He began noticing the same black Cadillac parked on streets near his apartment. Sometimes it would idle at a distance when he walked to his car. Other times it was just far enough away to be uncertain whether it was watching him at all. The more he paid attention, the more he realized that even mundane movements, going to the grocery store, visiting the library, seemed to be shadowed. A man in a suit at the magazine rack, another in the corner booth of a diner, always reading a newspaper but never turning pages. Richardson told only a handful of people about the encounters. One was a physics professor at the university who had a passing interest in UFO reports. The professor, instead of laughing it off, told him bluntly, "If those men are what I think they are, you don't want to test their patience." Despite the open threats, Richardson never went to the police. In 1967, the idea of walking into a Toledo precinct and saying, Two men in black suits threatened me over a UFO fragment. Seemed like an invitation to be dismissed. Or worse, to attract the attention of the very agencies he suspected were behind the visits. Privately, however, some people in the local UFO research community began whispering that Richardson's case fit a troubling pattern. The NICAP, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, files had several similar reports. Physical trace UFO cases where a witness retrieved material ... only for unidentified men, often presumed to be connected to the Air Force's OSI or another federal office, to appear and reclaim it. In most of those cases, the material was never seen again. When the analysis results from Richardson's fragment finally came back, they were inconclusive. The lab noted unusual structural properties, but stopped short of calling it extraterrestrial. Before a second round of tests could be conducted, the fragment vanished from the researcher's possession under circumstances never fully explained. Richardson's contact with the men in black ended as suddenly as it began. One day, the car was gone. The strangers stopped appearing, and life resumed its outward normality. But the sense of being observed, of being vulnerable to forces outside the reach of law or reason ... never left him ... in later years. When interviewed by UFO authors, Richardson was careful with his words. He never claimed the men were aliens, nor that the fragment was definitively from another world. What he emphasized instead was their demeanor ... controlled ... clinical, without emotion, and their knowledge, which seemed drawn from a source beyond normal surveillance. His story became part of the wider Men in Black mystery. Researchers saw it as another case where the goal wasn't to deny the event, but to take away anything physical that could prove it happened today ... The Robert Richardson incident is remembered less for the fleeting UFO sighting, and more for what came after. It became a textbook example in M literature. A case where a physical object was recovered from a UFO encounter, followed by a swift and precise response from unidentified agents. The intimidation extended beyond Richardson himself to those close to him. And in the end, the potential evidence was quietly removed from public reach. Richardson once remarked, "If they wanted the piece, they could have taken it from me that night." Coming back twice was about something else. They wanted me to remember them. For many who study the phenomenon, that is the lasting power of men in black encounters. The artifact may vanish, and the details of the sighting may fade, but the deliberate, surgical disruption of a witness's life leaves an imprint that decades cannot erase. The Jack Robinson surveillance case, New Jersey, USA, Spring 1968, Jersey City, New Jersey, USA. Early spring in Jersey City in 1968. Mary Robinson stepped out of her apartment building. She was on her way to work, coat pulled tight against the morning chill, when she noticed something strange. Across the street, parked at the curb, was a black sedan. A man sat behind the wheel, dressed in a dark suit, white shirt, and black tie. His face was pale, his features sharp, but oddly expressionless ... as if his expression had been set hours earlier and never changed. He was staring directly at her . At first, she thought it might be a coincidence, someone waiting for a friend, maybe a neighbor getting a ride. But the man didn't look away when she glanced at him ... and he didn't shift his posture. His eyes followed her as she walked toward the corner. Even when she turned down the block, she had the unnerving sense that he was still watching. Mary's husband, Jack Robinson, was no stranger to unusual attention. A respected figure in the New Jersey branch of the UFO research community, He had spent years quietly gathering reports, interviewing witnesses, and submitting findings to national organizations. But in recent months, he had been focusing on a series of close encounter reports that hinted at unusual activity in the area. The night before, Jack had mentioned to Mary that he felt someone had been in their apartment while they were out. Papers on his desk had been moved, a drawer slightly ajar that he swore he'd closed. Nothing was missing, but the disarray was too deliberate to be an accident. He had brushed it off as maybe his own carelessness. But now, seeing the man in the car, Mary felt the unease sharpen. She didn't tell Jack immediately. Instead, she noted the time, just after 8 a.m., and the license plate number, though the sequence seemed strangely unnumberable, as if it slid out of her thoughts minutes later. Asterisk that evening, when she came home, she asked Jack if anyone had contacted him recently about his work. He frowned, shook his head, and asked why. Mary told him about the man in the car. Jack listened without interrupting, his expression tightening as she described the suit, the unblinking stare. By the time she finished, he was already thinking of who in their circle might quietly confirm whether they were under observation at the next morning. The man was there again. Same car, same position, same posture. This time, Mary saw him adjust something in his lap. A notebook, perhaps, or a small device. But his gaze never left the front of their building. By the third day, Mary told Jack she was certain it wasn't random. She urged him to call someone. Jack decided to reach out to a friend, fellow UFO researcher Timothy Green Beckley, a man who had a reputation for chasing down leads others avoided. When Beckley heard the story, he didn't hesitate. He told Jack and Mary to stay put, and went straight to another contact, a photographer named Jim Mosley, who shared their interest in documenting the fringes of the UFO phenomenon. If the man was there the next morning, Beckley and Mosley would see for themselves. A4 began the same way. Pale sunlight, cool air, and the black sedan parked across from the Robinsons' apartment. The man inside looked exactly as Mary had described. Dark suit, hat pulled low, white shirt buttoned high, the kind of neatness that seemed almost staged. Beckley and Mosley parked half a block away and approached on foot, keeping their pace casual. As they drew closer, Beckley noted the man's stillness. No fidgeting, no signs of impatience, as though he could sit there indefinitely. His gaze stayed locked on the Robinsons' building. Even as the two men passed him, Mosley, with his camera already prepared, slowed enough to take a single quick photograph. The man didn't react. The click of the shutter, the proximity of strangers, none of it seemed to register. Beckley described it later as like taking a picture of a mannequin that happened to be breathing. That photograph would become one of the most circulated images in Men in Black lore, a grainy black and white showing the man in the sedan, hat casting a shadow over his eyes, his mouth set in a line that was neither a frown nor a smile, inside their apartment. Jack and Mary were relieved to have corroboration. It wasn't just in their heads. Someone was watching them. The question was who and why. Jack's work in UFO research was not classified, nor did it appear threatening to any agency on the surface. He compiled reports, chased rumors, and occasionally published in small newsletters. But lately, he had been speaking with witnesses whose accounts hinted at physical trace evidence, ground imprints, strange residue, even recovered objects. If those claims had substance, they could have attracted the wrong kind of attention. The Robinsons began to wonder if the man in the black sedan might be tied to a formal investigative body. The FBI, perhaps, or even the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, both known to have monitored UFO-related cases in the past. If so, his presence outside their home might not have been idle curiosity, but an authorized surveillance detail. That thought was no comfort. It meant the man could sit there day after day with an authority they could neither confirm nor challenge. Mary began to notice other changes. Twice, when she returned from errands, she was certain the apartment door's lock felt off. As though it had been handled roughly. Once she found that a small jewelry box on her dresser had been moved exactly 2 inches from where she'd left it. Nothing was missing, but the precision of the disturbance was unsettling. Jack's papers were another matter. A few pages of his latest case notes seemed to have been copied. He noticed the originals stacked out of order. And the edges of some pages slightly curled, as if they had been handled by damp fingers. He couldn't prove it, but the pattern was becoming hard to ignore. Observation from outside. Intrusion inside. By the end of the first week, the man in the car was no longer the only sign of surveillance. Jack began spotting a second figure, another man in a similar dark suit, standing in the lobby of their building at odd hours, never speaking. Always gone by the time Jack returned with company. Neighbors began asking questions. One woman down the hall mentioned the government guy in the car. Another tenant told Mary he had seen 2 men in suits walking slowly down the hallway outside their apartment late one night. They didn't knock. Didn't speak. Just walked. Stopped outside the Robinsons' door. Then left. The tension built in small, relentless ways. Jack found himself checking the street before leaving the apartment. Mary began drawing the curtains in the daytime, uneasy about the idea of unseen eyes looking in. Even their phone calls started to feel unnatural. Occasional clicks on the line, brief patches of static. When Beckley returned a week later, the car was still there. He and Mosley decided to try a more direct approach. They walked past the sedan again, slower this time. Beckley looked directly at the man and said, "Morning." The man didn't blink. He didn't acknowledge the greeting in any way. His head remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the building. Beckley later said the lack of reaction was more unnerving than any open threat. By the 10th day, the black sedan was gone. No explanation, no sign of the man, and no other obvious watchers. Life in the Robinsons' apartment returned to its routine. But the absence didn't erase the experience. Jack continued his research, though more cautiously. He locked his notes in a metal file cabinet, kept sensitive correspondence out of the apartment when possible, and told fewer people about the specifics of his investigations. Mary, for her part, never forgot the face in the car window, or the way his gaze made the air feel heavier when the photograph taken by Mosley began circulating among UFO researchers. It sparked debate. Some argued the man could have been a private investigator or a low-level government operative assigned to monitor Jack's activities. Others saw the image as proof of something stranger, an archetype of the men in black, captured in daylight. Their methods laid bare in the simplest of ways. Watching, waiting, and leaving without a trace. In later years, the Robinson case would be cited in conferences and books as one of the clearest visual documentations of MI surveillance. The image became a reference point, not because it proved the existence of the men in black beyond doubt, but because it fits so neatly into the accounts of dozens of other witnesses who described the same kind of quiet, deliberate monitoring. For Jack and Mary, the meaning was less about public proof and more about personal intrusion. The man in the car had never knocked on their door, never spoken to them directly, never issued a threat, yet his presence had changed the way they lived, if only for a short time. It was a reminder that being watched did not require confrontation, and that sometimes the most effective pressure was the kind that left nothing tangible behind, except, in this rare case, a single photograph, and the memory of a man who sat in silence day after day. For reasons he never explained, the Paul Miller case, North Dakota, USA. The Paul Miller case, North Dakota, USA. 1961. Minute, North Dakota, USA. The night over North Dakota in 1961 was cold and still, the kind that swallows sound. Paul Miller, a young Air Force reservist, was returning from a hunting trip with 3 companions when something unusual cut across the dark. They saw it only briefly, a glowing object hovering low in a nearby field. 2 figures emerged from it, moving strangely toward a fence line. Miller, on instinct, raised his rifle and fired. The next thing they knew, they were back in the car, heading toward Minute Air Force Base. Their watches showed hours had passed, but none of them could recall leaving the field. No report was filed. No one wanted to be the one to explain it to superiors. The 4 men exchanged a silent agreement to keep it to themselves, knowing that anything unusual discussed too openly on base could quickly turn into a matter involving intelligence officers from the Office of Special Investigations, OSI. Or another federal branch. The next morning, Miller was at his desk when the call came through. "Stay where you are. Visitors are on their way." It was phrased with the kind of quiet authority that left no room for questions. 2 men arrived within the hour. They were dressed identically in dark suits, white shirts, and narrow black ties. Their faces were pale, their expressions fixed in something close to blank. Without greeting, one of them said in a flat voice, "Mr. Miller, you had an encounter last night." The phrasing made Miller pause. He hadn't told anyone on base. "I don't know what you mean," he replied. The second man placed a folder on the desk. Inside was a typed sheet. His name, address, family members, even his service history down to the name of his elementary school. Miller stared at it, then looked up. "You shot at something you shouldn't have." The first man said. Miller felt his chest tighten. "Who told you that?" Neither man answered. Instead, one leaned closer, his voice low, but without inflection. "We know what you saw, and we know where you live. It would be best if you forgot about last night." When Miller asked who they were with, the answer came quickly. "That's not important." The exchange lasted no more than 10 minutes. They left as abruptly as they had arrived. From his office window, Miller watched them walk in perfect step to a black sedan parked at the far end of the lot. It was in a section of the base usually reserved for official vehicles, the kind often used by OSI agents or visiting Department of Defense personnel, and no one questioned its presence. The car pulled away without making a sound he could hear. That evening. Miller checked every lock on his doors twice. He kept the rifle within arm's reach. Over the following days, he noticed a black car parked along the road to his home at odd hours. Once, through the curtain, he saw a man sitting in the driver's seat, facing forward, wearing dark sunglasses despite the gray sky. His hunting companions began reporting similar experiences. A strange car trailing them for a few blocks, men in suits loitering across from their homes and disappearing when approached. None of them had spoken openly about the encounter, yet the scrutiny was unmistakable. The unease wasn't just in their heads. On base ... Miller began to feel conversations stop when he entered a room. A colleague in uniform once asked him if someone from higher up had been in touch, then quickly changed the subject. He noticed two unknown men in civilian clothes standing near the mess hall one afternoon, watching him as he passed. They didn't speak, only tracked him with their eyes until he was out of sight. The effect on his mind was slow and corrosive. He became hyper-aware of his surroundings, glancing in rear-view mirrors, pausing before unlocking his front door, scanning parked cars as he walked to work. Even routine noises, a phone ringing, footsteps in the corridor, sometimes made him tense ... waiting for another knock on the door. Another uninvited visit, his family noticed the change. He spoke less at dinner, sat up later at night ... sometimes staring out the window for long stretches. When his wife asked what was wrong, he would say nothing, but she could tell it was more than fatigue. The base community was small, and word traveled even without official channels. While no one confronted him directly, Miller sensed his name had been attached to something out of the ordinary. One mechanic he knew well avoided eye contact for weeks. Another colleague quietly warned him to be careful who you talk to. Weeks passed, then months. The surveillance tapered off, but the memory of it didn't. Miller left the Air Force Reserve a few years later, but the incident remained with him. When in the late 1960s and early 70s, researchers began documenting patterns in so-called men in black visits, Miller recognized the descriptions instantly. The unshakable formality, the strange knowledge, the quiet but heavy intimidation. It wasn't until the late 1970s that Miller agreed to share the story in detail with a UFO researcher. Even then, he hesitated, worried that talking about it might call them back. He admitted that for years after the visit, he had nightmares about returning to the office and finding the two men already sitting there, waiting for him. By the time the account entered UFO literature, the original sighting had become almost secondary. The focus was on the precision and speed of the response, the way they had approached within hours, armed with personal and military background, and issued a warning without any official acknowledgement. Researchers who examined the case pointed out the unusual level of coordination. If the men were from a recognized military or intelligence agency, OSI... Air Force Intelligence, or even the CIA, they should have identified themselves. Yet they hadn't. If they weren't, how had they gained such quick access to Miller's service file and movements? And if their goal was to silence him, why had they chosen to make their presence so obvious? Miller didn't dwell on the broader theories. For him, the experience was not an academic problem, but a memory that remained sharp in all the wrong ways. He remembered the slight delay before each man spoke, as if they were following an internal rhythm. He remembered how their footsteps matched exactly when they turned to leave, how their shoulders never shifted, how not a strand of hair seemed out of place. Even decades later, when Miller was well into middle age, he kept the telling of the story sparse. He sometimes ended it by saying ... It was the quiet that got to me. They didn't have to yell. They already knew I'd remember every word. Among those who heard him speak, the impact was lasting. In small UFO discussion groups and private correspondence, his case was cited as one of the clearest examples of Mabe behavior, stripped of theatrics... built entirely on controlled presence and the weight of implied authority. Some listeners admitted that it wasn't the content of the warning that disturbed them, but the idea that such an encounter could happen so quickly, without explanation, and then dissolve back into daily life as though it had never occurred. That, perhaps, was the most enduring legacy of the Paul Miller case. It demonstrated that whatever the men in black were, government agents, something stranger, or something in between, their influence lay not in force, but in certainty. They arrived when they wished, said what they intended to say, and left without asking permission. And for those on the receiving end, the silence afterward was never empty. It was a waiting space, filled with the knowledge that if the door opened again, it wouldn't be by chance. The Albert K. Bender, Bridgeport Encounters, Connecticut, USA. Albert K. Bender, The Bridgeport Encounters, 1953. Bridgeport, Connecticut, USA. In 1953, another case surfaced. This time happened in the industrial city of Bridgeport, Connecticut. Albert K. Bender was not a fisherman or a casual observer. He was the founder of the International Flying Saucer Bureau, a small but growing network of enthusiasts trading sightings, theories, and clippings by mail. His top-floor apartment at 784 Broad Street doubled as the Bureau's headquarters, each surface crowded with files and correspondence. That summer, Bender had been preparing an issue of Space Review, the Bureau's bulletin. In it, he hinted that the UFO mystery had been solved, a conclusion he intended to reveal in the next issue. Before that could happen, something changed. It began with a strange heaviness in the air when he worked at his desk at night. Sometimes a faint odor, like sulfur or ozone, would drift in. His thoughts would blur. A pressure would build behind his eyes. One evening in late July, the sensation came on stronger than ever. He was alone in the apartment. The clock on the wall ticked past 9 when the air seemed to drop a few degrees. The light from the desk lamp dimmed, though the bulb did not flicker. Then he knew he wasn't alone. 3 men stood in the room. He had not heard the door. They were dressed identically. Black suits, black hats, narrow black ties, crisp white shirts. Their skin was pale, almost gray, and their eyes, he would later say, had a strange luminous quality, as though light reflected from within. They did not sit. They did not remove their hats. One of them, taller than the rest, spoke in a low, flat voice that carried no particular accent. They told him they knew he had been collecting material on flying saucers. They told him to stop. Bender sat frozen, his hands on his knees. He could not recall them threatening him outright, but the message was final. His mouth felt dry, and when he tried to speak, his voice came out weak. One of the men stepped closer. Bender noticed a metallic glint at the man's wrist. Not a watch, but something smooth and curved, half hidden under the cuff. He could not place it. A wave of dizziness passed over him. For a moment, his vision blurred. When it cleared, the men were gone. The days after the visit passed in a kind of haze. His headaches worsened. He lost track of hours. Letters from Bureau members went unanswered. He found himself leaving the office early, walking aimlessly through the city. Then, in early September, they came again. This time, Bender had been lying down, trying to fight off one of the headaches. When the air thickened, the same smell, sulfur, sharp and faintly metallic, seeped in. He opened his eyes to see the 3 men standing at the foot of the bed. They didn't repeat their warning. Instead, they conveyed, without speaking at length, that he was close to the truth. He would later insist they communicated partly in words and partly in thoughts that were simply there, already formed in his mind. One of them produced a small circular object from inside his jacket. Its surface seemed to shift in the light, like liquid metal. Bender felt a sudden chill, followed by the sense that the room was receding. He could hear them, but the words were muffled, as if coming from another floor. Then he blacked out. When he woke, the room was empty. Hours had passed within a week. He made his decision. Bender closed the International Flying Saucer Bureau. In the October issue of Space Review, he printed a short notice. The mystery of the flying saucers is no longer a mystery. The source is known, but any information about this is being withheld by order from a higher source. No further explanation appeared. There was no next issue. To his members, it made no sense. The Bureau had been active and ambitious. Its network had grown to multiple countries. Now, it had stopped overnight without a clear reason. Bender offered no details in public. In private, he told a few correspondents about the visits, but never named the men. He would not speak on the record until years later, when he finally published his account in 1962 in the book Flying Saucers and the Three Men. The details were as strange as the silence had suggested. He described the three visitors not just as men in black suits, but as entities who could appear and vanish at will, whose presence was accompanied by an unnatural cold and a distinctive odor. He claimed they had shown him visions of their origin, another world, and a reason for their secrecy. Skeptics dismissed it as imagination, the product of a man too deep in his own files. Supporters pointed to the timing. His shutdown had been abrupt. His demeanor changed, and his warnings consistent in private letters to friends long before the book. What stood out, even to those who doubted the extraterrestrial element, was the precision of the encounter. The men had arrived unannounced, without names or identification. They had not argued, only instructed. And when Bender complied, they did not return ... over the years. The Bridgeport case became a reference point in Men in Black research. Investigators noted the shared elements with later accounts: the black suits, the unnatural stillness of the room, the invasive knowledge of the witness's activities, and the unspoken pressure to abandon the subject. For Albert Bender, the encounters ended as abruptly as they had begun. He married, moved away, and withdrew from public UFO research. But the shadow of those visits, and the decision they forced, stayed with him. The IFSB had lasted just 2 years. Its end, and the silence that followed, left a gap in early UFO community history. The Bureau's members had been eager for the next stage of investigation. Instead, they were left with a single sentence: a solution found, a truth withheld, and an instruction obeyed. In the decades that followed, others would echo his story. Some described men who looked almost identical to one another, who appeared in pairs or threes, whose voices were flat, whose questions were already answers. Some were told to destroy photographs, others to hand over debris, others simply to forget. But in 1953, Albert Bender was among the first to face them, and to stop completely. If the flying saucers were the mystery, the men were the consequence. And in case after case, a consequence returned, unannounced, unshaken, and already knowing what you had seen. Still with us in the dark, everyone, and you're braver than most. If these encounters have kept you here, leave a like. And if this is your first time walking these shadowed paths, subscribe, so the next strange night finds you again. Now, let's step back into the stories. The Gray Barkers Collected Reports, West Virginia, USA. Gray Barkers Collected Reports, 1950s to 1960s. Clarksburg, West Virginia, USA. After Albert K. Bender shut down the International Flying Saucer Bureau in 1953, the news sent a quiet shock wave through the small, tightly connected UFO community. One of those paying close attention was a young writer from West Virginia named Gray Barker. By day, he worked for a film distribution company. By night, often well past midnight, he documented what he and many others saw as America's most puzzling mystery. A flying saucer phenomenon. Barker had never met Bender in person, but they had exchanged clippings and letters through the Bureau. sharing accounts of sightings from their respective regions. When Bender's abrupt silence came, Barker's curiosity sharpened, equal parts journalist and puzzle solver. He began pulling together notes, letters, and interviews, the earliest pages of what would become his collected reports. His first lead was a letter from one of Bender's old contacts, hinting that Bender had been persuaded, in person, to stop. Barker arranged to travel to Bridgeport in late autumn of 1953. The air was sharp, with salt from Long Island Sound when he stepped off the train. Bender agreed to meet, but only in a hotel lobby. Neutral ground. Barker arrived early, the dim light from the tall lamps pooling in yellow circles across the carpet. When Bender walked in, he looked thinner than in photographs. His eyes shadowed Dot. They spoke for less than half an hour. Bender didn't name names. He didn't need to. Phrases like higher source and it's best to leave it alone carried the weight of something more than ordinary secrecy. Barker sensed there were sentences Bender wanted to say, but wouldn't. They shook hands and parted. Barker turned toward the elevator to head up to his room. Halfway down the hallway, he realized he was no longer alone. A man stood ahead, still enough for his features to blur in shadow. Barker first thought it might be another guest, until the man stepped into the yellow spill from a wall sconce. Black suit, white shirt, narrow tie, hat in his hand. The man didn't speak at first, only looking at Barker, then past him as if measuring the space between them. The hallway felt unnaturally still. No voices from other rooms. No sound from the lobby below. Even the faint hum of the light fixtures seemed to fade. Barker nodded politely and moved to pass. The man didn't step aside. When Barker slowed, the man finally spoke, his voice flat and without any clear accent. "You won't get what you're looking for." It wasn't a question or a threat, more like an already settled fact. Before Barker could respond, the man stepped into the next corridor and vanished. When Barker followed a second later, the hall was empty. No door had closed. No footsteps echoed. Back in his room, Barker found the envelope holding his notes from the meeting. The flap was unsealed, though he was certain he'd closed it downstairs before heading up. In the years that followed, Barker kept collecting, not just UFO reports, but accounts of silent visitors. Most came secondhand, letters describing men who arrived in black cars, asked too many questions, or told witnesses to forget. Barker noticed the tone that ran through these reports. People weren't simply describing meetings. They were trying to explain the unnerving sense that someone else had been steering the conversation from the start. By the late 1950s, Barker was recognized in the UFO community as someone who didn't just gather stories. He saw patterns, When a report crossed his desk in 1961 with unusually specific details, he decided to investigate in person. The letter came from Paul Henderson, a part-time radio technician living outside Parkersburg, West Virginia. Henderson claimed that after he reported a low-level disc sighting to a local newspaper, two men in black suits had shown up at his home. They not only knew what he had told the paper, they knew the exact time he'd gone outside, the direction he'd been facing, and that he'd taken a Polaroid photograph. Barker called the next day. Henderson sounded nervous, but agreed to meet if Barker came alone. The road to Henderson's house wound through low hills, bare winter trees rattling in the wind. When Barker arrived, the yard was empty except for an old sedan. Inside. Henderson fidgeted with the strap of his wristwatch as he recounted the visit. The knock at the door just after sundown. The two men stepping inside without invitation. They never gave names. One briefly showed a card with lettering Henderson couldn't read before tucking it away. They didn't ask for the photo. Henderson said, "They told me I wouldn't find it worth keeping. Said it would fade, ... Like it was nothing important. Barker asked to see it. Henderson opened a drawer, took out an envelope, and slid the photograph across the table. The image was pale, washed out, not from age, but as if the exposure itself had been drained. A faint circular outline hovered over the tree line, the rest nearly white dot as Barker studied it. He realized the room had gone unnaturally quiet. The tick of the wall clock was the only sound. He glanced at the window. A black sedan idled at the far edge of the drive. Two figures sat inside ... Faces turned toward the house. Barker looked back at Henderson ... who had gone pale. "That's them," he said quietly, without further discussion. Barker gathered his notes, thanked Henderson, and left. By the time he stepped outside, the car was gone. Only the wind moved through the trees. The next morning ... Barker found the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, the one holding Henderson's original letter, unlocked. He never left it that way. That was enough to confirm the pattern. A sighting is reported. A visit follows. The witness withdraws. Sometimes evidence disappears. Sometimes it's rendered meaningless. And always, the visitors leave without names or credentials, but with a parting line that weighs more than any formal threat. For Barker, these two encounters, one in a hotel hallway, one on a back road in West Virginia ... showed that Bender's experience wasn't unique. The same stillness in the air, the same compression of sound, the same pale faces and flat voices appeared again and again. They knew too much about flying saucers. Barker wove Bender's story together with others, creating what is often called the first public outline of the Men in Black. Critics accused him of embellishment. Supporters argued he had mapped the edges of a deliberate effort to keep the UFO question unanswered. By the late 1960s, Barker knew he was no longer just an observer. He had been in the hallway. He had seen the car. And like the others ... he understood the unspoken rule. Sightings are only part of the mystery. The visits are what follow. They didn't arrive with warning, and they never needed to explain themselves. You simply knew, in that moment, that your story was no longer yours alone. Asterisk the Solway Firth Spaceman Photo. England Solway Firth Spaceman Photo. ... England. May 23rd, 1964 ... Berg Marsh, Cumbria, England, on May 23rd, 1964 ... Jim Templeton, a fireman from Carlisle, took his wife Annie and their young daughter Elizabeth to Berg Marsh near the Solway Firth. It was a quiet, open place, and he brought his camera to take a few family photographs. He snapped 3 shots of Elizabeth as she sat on the grass in a light blue dress. 2 were unremarkable. In the middle frame ... however, a tall white figure appeared behind her, bulky in the shoulders with a smooth, rounded head shape. Neither Jim nor Annie had seen anyone in the area. The marsh was empty, and it would have been impossible for someone to walk in and vanish unnoticed. When the film was developed, the figure was undeniable. Friends urged him to take it to the police. They saw nothing suspicious in the negative and sent him to Kodak, who confirmed it was a single, untampered exposure. A local paper published the image, calling it the Solway Firth Spaceman. It made its way into national headlines, and Templeton found himself answering questions from journalists. He had no theories, only the photograph. That was when 2 men came to see him. They arrived without warning at the Carlisle fire station where Templeton worked. They wore dark suits, white shirts, and narrow ties. Both were tall, clean-shaven ... and spoke with an accent Templeton couldn't place. They introduced themselves only as Number 9 and Number 11. No names ... No business cards. They said they were from the government, but did not specify which department. Their manner was polite ... but oddly formal, almost rehearsed. The men asked Templeton to accompany them back to Berg Marsh. He agreed ... and they drove together in a dark sedan ... The two men in the front, Templeton in the back. On the way, they spoke very little, asking only whether he still had the negatives, and whether he had shown them to anyone else once at the marsh ... The questions became more detailed. They asked about the weather, the direction of the wind ... and whether there had been any aircraft overhead that day. They wanted to know exactly where he had been standing, which way he was facing, and whether he had noticed anything unusual. Sounds ... smells ... sudden changes in temperature. Templeton repeated what he had told the police and Kodak. The afternoon had been calm and uneventful. No one else had been nearby, and nothing strange had been visible at the time. The men listened, but their expressions didn't change. One of them asked again whether Templeton was sure he hadn't seen anyone, even at a distance. Then came a question that unsettled him. Did he believe the figure was connected to anything he might have read about in the news? Templeton said he didn't know. The man pressed. Was he withholding information? Templeton denied it. The tone shifted. The two men exchanged a brief glance, ended the questioning, and told Templeton that the matter was best forgotten. Without another word, they walked back to their car and drove off, leaving him standing on the marsh. He never saw them again. The visit stayed with him. Their refusal to identify themselves, the way they referred to each other by numbers, and their suggestion that he forget the whole thing left him uneasy. In later interviews, he would say that the men seemed less interested in understanding the photograph than engaging what he thought about it, and perhaps how much he was prepared to say publicly. Not long after, he received a call from an Australian reporter claiming that figures resembling the one in his photograph had been seen at the Woomera test range during a missile launch. The figures, reportedly in white and helmeted, had been spotted inside a restricted area, causing a test to be delayed. The reporter said photographs existed, though none were ever released. Templeton was struck by the timing. The Woomera incident was said to have happened within days of his photograph ... but he could never confirm the claim. The Australian government refused to comment, and British authorities offered no information. If any official link existed between the two events, it remained hidden. The story, fueled by the photograph's publication, continued to circulate. Skeptics argued that the spaceman could have been Annie Templeton stepping briefly into the frame, her dress overexposed by bright sunlight to appear white. Proponents countered that the figure was taller and broader than Annie ... and that the helmet-like head and rigid stance didn't match her posture or proportions. Templeton and Annie both insisted she had been several yards away at the time. As the years passed, Templeton noticed that the interest from officials, or people claiming to be officials ... had not entirely gone away. A few months after the visit to the marsh, he was approached by another pair of men in suits, this time at his home. They asked similar questions, though in a less formal tone. He suspected they were connected to the first two visitors, but these men identified themselves only as investigators and said nothing about where they were from. Their questions again circled around his memory of the day and whether he had seen or heard anything unusual. He also received letters from people who claimed to have seen similar figures in remote areas, often near military installations or test sites. Some wrote that they had been questioned afterward by unidentified men. Templeton began to wonder whether his experience was part of a larger pattern. By the 1970s, the photograph had appeared in books and television programs about unexplained phenomena. The men in dark suits were often mentioned alongside it, drawing comparisons to other cases where witnesses to unusual events reported visits from anonymous officials. In UFO research circles, such accounts were informally grouped under the Men in Black label. Though Templeton himself rarely used the term, he stuck to the facts as he experienced them. Two unknown men, formal in dress and manner, who arrived without explanation, questioned him in detail, and told him to forget what he had seen. Speculation about their identity ranged from intelligence officers to private contractors working for defense agencies. The proximity of Burg Marsh to military testing ranges in the UK, and the mention of WOOMER about gave weight to theories that the interest was less about aliens and more about something captured in the background, equipment, personnel, or a test that should not have been photographed. Others, more inclined toward the paranormal, saw the figures as part of a deliberate effort to suppress sightings of unexplained beings. Templeton maintained that he had nothing to hide and nothing to gain from fabricating the story. He never sold the negative, refused offers of payment for exclusive rights, and allowed only copies to be made for analysis. He often expressed frustration that the photograph had disrupted his life, but he never withdrew his account of the visit to the Marsh ... or the strange men who questioned him. Even decades later, the Solway case was cited as one of the more intriguing intersections between photographic evidence and unexplained official interest. Analysts who examined the negative agreed it was a genuine, untampered image. What they disagreed on was the nature of the figure and the reason for the visits. If it was a person, who were they and why were they there? And if the figure was unrelated to anything earthly ... why had Templeton been told to forget about it? The case still sits in a gray area, neither fully debunked nor definitively proven. For those interested in photographic mysteries, it remains a rare example of an image that withstood technical scrutiny, yet brought its photographer into contact with people whose identity and purpose were never made clear. For those interested in the lore of unexplained encounters, it stands as a reminder that sometimes the most persistent questions are not about what appears in a photograph, but about who comes asking questions afterward. The Point Pleasant Mothman Wave, West Virginia, USA. The Point Pleasant Mothman Wave, West Virginia, USA. November 1966, December 1967. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, USA. Point Pleasant, West Virginia, in late 1966, was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's names, where the day's small talk was about the weather, the Ohio River's levels ... or the Friday football game. That changed in November when a handful of people claimed to have seen something large and winged near the old munition storage grounds north of town, a place locals simply called the TNT area. Those sightings made the local paper, but it was what happened afterward that left the deeper mark. The people who had spoken up ... farmers ... shopkeepers ... young couples, a school teacher, began to get visits. The strangers who came were polite but unsettling, always dressed in dark suits, arriving without warning, and rarely offering names. What they wanted, no one could quite explain, but it was clear they were interested in more than just collecting statements. Mary Heyer, The Athens Messenger's Point Pleasant correspondent, ... became the hub for sighting reports. She was used to interviewing people about floods or county fairs. But soon her office filled with visitors recounting unusual events. A shadow passing low over a bar roof. Red lights drifting across the river. A figure on a roadside. She took notes, wrote up her column, Where the Waters Mingle, and filed the clippings in her desk. That's when the other kind of visits began. One of the earliest came to a farmer outside town who had spoken to Hire about seeing the winged figure in his pasture at dusk. Days later, a black sedan pulled up the long gravel lane to his house. Two men stepped out, both tall, wearing dark coats and hats. They asked if they could clarify a few points from his account. They started off just asking what I'd already told Mary, he said years later. Then they got real specific. Wanted to know if I'd told anyone else, ... If I'd written it down. When I asked who they were, one of them smiled and said, That's not important. The conversation ended with a remark the farmer never forgot. Things are less complicated if they're left alone. He told Hire that what unsettled him most wasn't the warning. It was the feeling they already knew his answers before he spoke. Another visit came to a woman who had reported strange lights moving low over the Ohio River one night. Two men came to her door after dark, their car idling in the street. They were polite, she said. Not scary, just cold, like they'd practiced being nice. They asked where she'd been standing, the direction she'd been looking, and whether she could draw the light's path. They never wrote anything down, she recalled, but they repeated my answers right back to me, ... Exact words. When she looked outside a minute after they left, the street was empty. She hadn't heard the car drive away. Hire herself experienced something similar. The first signs were phone calls, silent lines that stayed open for half a minute, sometimes broken by an electronic beep before disconnecting. Then one afternoon, a man came into her office. She described him later as short, with long black hair, a sallow complexion, and an oddly stiff posture. He didn't waste time with introductions, Hire told a fellow reporter. He asked about the articles I'd written on the sightings, then suddenly changed the subject to city lights. Wanted to know the colors, whether they were regular. I told him what I could, and he just walked out without another word. By January 1967, Hire's desk drawers held more than just sighting reports. She began collecting these accounts of unannounced visitors, filing them alongside creature and UFO sightings. A teenage witness told her about an old model black sedan that had pulled up outside his house. Two men in matching coats got out and wanted to go over his sighting again. They started dropping in things they shouldn't know, the boy told her. The name of my dog, where my sister worked, my mom's birthday. They didn't ask ... They told me, like they were checking if they were right. In town, a hardware store owner had his own run-in. He had mentioned to friends that he'd seen a figure on his roof one night. A week later, two men came into his store while he was closing. They didn't say who they were with, just started asking about my deliveries. What trucks came? What time? If anything unusual had been dropped off. It didn't have much to do with what I saw. They left without buying a thing. Other encounters were less direct, but no less strange. A shop assistant who had given Hire a written statement about seeing red lights over the river found her statement missing from her own desk at home. A folder left open. A mechanic who had been interviewed by a pair of strangers said he later noticed the same car parked near his garage for 3 nights in a row, never moving during daylight hours. While none of these visitors claimed to be from a specific agency, Their style had the air of official ... clipped language, formal dress, controlled body language. Some witnesses assumed they were government investigators. Others weren't so sure. Local law enforcement quietly acknowledged the visits. A county deputy admitted to Heyer that a few of his own witnesses had been spoken to before he could follow up. "I don't know who they were," he told her, "but they weren't ours." A state trooper recalled seeing a dark sedan with out-of-state plates parked near the TNT area late one night, its engine running, but no one visible inside. As the year went on, the visits often seemed less about gathering facts and more about shaping what would be said. Witnesses reported subtle but clear pressure not to talk to reporters ... or to alter certain details for clarity. "They told me flat out I was mistaken," one witness remembered. "I told them I knew what I saw, and they just kept shaking their heads like they were humoring a child." The psychological impact was real. Several witnesses withdrew from public discussion entirely. A young couple who had been among the first to report the winged figure avoided answering their phone unless they recognized the caller. "We didn't want to deal with it anymore," the husband said decades later. "It wasn't worth the looks you'd get in town, or the knocks on the door." A retired railroad worker who had given a detailed description of a nighttime encounter stopped talking about it even with friends. "Didn't need the trouble," he told Heyer when she asked why. In December 1967, the visits seemed to increase. More than one witness later recalled being questioned again in the days before the Silver Bridge collapsed on the 15th, killing 46 people in the freezing Ohio River. In a few of these cases, the questions were directly about the bridge, its traffic ... the time of day people crossed it, without explanation. After the collapse, the sightings of the winged figure stopped. So did most of the visits, though some witnesses received follow-up calls asking if they had noticed anything else unusual since the accident. For many, the end of the sightings didn't bring relief. Instead ... it left them with unanswered questions about why they had been singled out and by whom. Heyer kept her files until her death in 1970. When researchers later examined them, they found the sighting reports and the visitor accounts intertwined, often on the same page. Over 13 months, Point Pleasant had seen not just a wave of unusual aerial reports, but a quieter campaign of direct contact with those who spoke up. Speculation about the visitor's identity has varied ever since. Some believe they were federal agents sent to investigate in secrecy, though no agency has ever claimed the role. Others think they were private contractors hired by defense or intelligence organizations. More speculative theories suggest they weren't tied to any known institution at all. What stands out is the consistency of the accounts. Dark cars on rural roads, pairs of men in near-identical clothing, formal speech, precise questioning, no names offered, and an air of knowing more than they said. Whether their goal was to gather data, discredit witnesses, or simply monitor the spread of certain stories, they left behind the same lingering feeling that someone was paying close attention. Today ... Point Pleasant's legacy in Men in Black lore rivals the more famous UFO cases. The winged figure might be what made headlines, but for many who lived through it, the real mystery was the knock on the door afterward. Thank you for walking these shadows with us tonight. The Men in Black, always close, never gone. Are they watching you right now? We may never know, but the stories remain. Until next time, keep your eyes on the sky ... your door locked ... and your mind open to Dreamtime Discoveries.